Tasha Williams walked briskly through the quiet, dimly lit streets of the neighborhood she'd grown to love. The city was always a mixed bag, quiet, familiar at times, yet unpredictable. This evening, the air was crisp, carrying the promise of rain. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the familiar alley that led toward her apartment. It was then that she noticed the group of men standing on the street corner. At first, she didn't think much of it. People gathered all the time around these blocks, passing the time, chatting, or waiting for something to happen. But there was something about this group, 5 men, leaning against the wall of an old, crumbling building, that made her gut tighten. They were loud, boisterous, their laughter cutting through the evening calm like a sharp knife. And their eyes, narrowing with a gleam of unspoken hostility, were fixed firmly on her. Tasha had always prided herself on her ability to read a room, to pick up on the slightest shifts in atmosphere. This wasn't just an idle group of guys hanging out. No, they were sizing her up, eyeing her like a target. She kept walking, her stride steady, but her senses were on high alert. The sound of footsteps followed her, echoing against the pavement. Her mind raced through the drills, the combat strategies she perfected during her time in the Navy SEALs. Every step, every choice mattered. "Hey there, pretty lady," one of them called out. The voice was thick with mockery. Tasha didn't break her pace. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She could feel their eyes on her, their leering gazes, their confidence in the anonymity of the night. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know her past. To them, she was just another woman, alone in the dark. But Tasha had never been alone. She was never truly vulnerable, not even here. As she neared the corner, the group shifted, blocking her path. Todd, the largest of the men, stepped forward, a smirk twisting his face. His clothes were worn, a bandana tied around his head, tattoos on his arms that told the stories of his past. He looked like someone who had seen a few too many fights and still carried the scars to prove it. His gang hung back, watching eagerly, their expressions a mix of excitement and curiosity. "Where you think you're going, sweetheart?" Todd asked, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. Tasha stopped, her gaze unwavering. "Excuse me, I'm not interested." Todd laughed, the sound harsh. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her skin. "Not interested, huh? You sure? You look like you could use some company." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her jacket. For a moment, Tasha remained still, her mind racing. She'd been in situations like this before, many times. She could already feel his grip, strong but sloppy, full of arrogance. She could break free with ease, but she didn't want to escalate this unnecessarily. "You don't want to do this," she said calmly, her voice low but firm. She didn't raise her voice or threaten him. She simply spoke with the quiet confidence that had gotten her through far worse moments in her life. Todd's grin widened, but there was something colder in his eyes now. The words that came next were laced with contempt, but Tasha heard them all too clearly. "Oh, I think you'll like this," he sneered, trying to drag her toward the alleyway. The others watched, their hands twitching, some eager, others uncertain. They didn't know what they were about to provoke. Tasha's eyes narrowed as she measured the situation in a split second. She could end this now, but her mind wasn't focused on violence. It was focused on survival. And in a split second, she made her decision. Todd's grip tightened on Tasha's arm, and for a moment, he believed he had the upper hand. He thought his sheer size and bravado would intimidate her into submission, but Tasha's calm gaze never wavered. She didn't pull or struggle. Instead, she seemed to almost assess him, as if she were watching a move in a chess game, calculating each piece's next action. "You really don't want to do this," Tasha repeated, her voice steady, but with a hint of warning that didn't reach Todd's ears. But the gang wasn't listening. Todd, more annoyed than anything else, stepped closer, his body pushing into hers. "What's wrong, girl? You scared of a little fun?" His words were a challenge, as much as a provocation. Tasha's pulse remained steady, her breathing slow and measured, just as she had been taught in high-intensity situations. She had trained for far worse. The harsh words, the glares, even the attempt to drag her into the alley, all were part of an unwelcome routine she had lived through before. But what made this different was the group surrounding her, thinking they had power over her. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know how wrong they were. Todd, seeing that she wasn't backing down, jerked her arm again, this time with more force, trying to pull her toward the alleyway. That was his first mistake. He underestimated her reaction time. Tasha's hand shot out, not in a wild attempt to break free, but with the precise, controlled force of someone who had fought in life-or-death situations. She turned sharply, her body a well-honed machine, and twisted her arm from Todd's grip. The movement was so fluid, so swift, that Todd's own momentum worked against him. His body was thrown slightly off balance. Without a moment's hesitation, Tasha followed through with the next step, her elbow striking sharply into the side of his chest. The blow wasn't overly aggressive, but it landed with surgical accuracy. Todd stumbled back, winded, gasping for air. He hadn't expected the speed or the power behind it. His eyes widened as he looked up at her, surprised to see her still standing there, calm as ever. "Who the hell?" he began, but he didn't get the chance to finish. He looked down to see his own hand still outstretched toward her. But this time, Tasha's grip was on his wrist. With a swift movement, she spun him around, using his own body weight against him. She could feel his muscle beneath her fingertips, but it was his lack of awareness that gave her the upper hand. Todd was no longer leading this encounter. She was. The rest of the gang stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. They had expected an easy confrontation, a little harassment that might make them feel powerful. Instead, they were watching their leader being effortlessly handled by a woman they had assumed was nothing more than a target. One of the men, younger and skinnier than the rest, took a hesitant step forward. He raised his fist, ready to throw a punch. But before he could even react, Tasha was already behind him. She moved like a shadow, her foot striking the back of his knee, causing him to lose balance. He crashed to the ground with a pained grunt. The remaining gang members looked at each other, confused and nervous. Todd was still reeling from the impact of Tasha's precise moves, trying to recover his breath. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The younger man scrambled to his feet, but found himself quickly outmatched, unsure of what to do next. Tasha's eyes never left Todd, her expression steady and unflinching. She could feel the shift in the air as the tension began to build. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They might have been big and loud, but she had the calm, controlled power of someone who had been trained to handle far more than street brawls. "What did I tell you?" she said, her voice calm but piercing. "You don't want to do this." Todd, his arrogance faltering, took a step back, his hands up in defeat. His pride was shattered, but his fear was growing. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. It was a moment of realization for him. He wasn't dealing with someone who would fold. This was a woman who had mastered the art of survival. The rest of the gang members, seeing their leader falter, exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere shifted. What had started as a simple intimidation had turned into something far more serious. Tasha stood in the middle of them, composed, her stance grounded. They had no idea what had just happened, how the tables had turned so quickly. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Todd staggered back, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his composure. The once loud, brash attitude that had defined him just moments before now seemed distant. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his eyes flicking nervously between Tasha and the rest of his gang. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't some defenseless woman he could push around. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't afraid. Tasha stood firm, her expression a calm contrast to the mounting chaos around her. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the cracked pavement. Her body was tense but poised, every muscle aware of the men surrounding her. She knew the game had shifted from one of intimidation to one of control, but she also knew that if she let them regroup, they might try something more desperate. Todd's eyes darted to his gang, as if searching for reassurance. The younger man who had fallen earlier was back on his feet now, rubbing his knee but still looking shaky. The other three men were uncertain, exchanging glances as if wondering whether they should keep going or cut their losses and run. "Get her, Todd," one of them shouted, his voice laced with anger. "She's just one woman. We can take her." But Todd didn't seem so sure anymore. He wiped his mouth again, the taste of defeat fresh on his tongue. His hands were shaking, not from physical pain, but from the dawning realization that they had underestimated her and the fear that came with it. Tasha's eyes flicked to the man who had spoken. Her gaze was laser-sharp, calculating, and the gang member immediately felt the weight of her focus. He hesitated, then took a half-step back, his confidence quickly evaporating. It was Todd who broke the silence. "No," he said hoarsely, his voice laced with frustration. "I don't know who the hell you are, lady, but we're not done here." His bravado returned, but it was tinged with fear. "You think you're tough. We'll show you just how tough we are." He gestured for the others to advance, but none of them moved. They were more hesitant now, and Tasha could see that the shift in their mindset had begun. She'd seen it before in her time in the military. The shift from confident aggression to doubt and fear. "Listen to me," Tasha said quietly, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension. "I told you once, and I'll say it again. You don't want to do this." She wasn't threatening, just stating a fact. Todd's eyes narrowed. "I don't take orders from you." He took a step toward her, this time with a dangerous edge to his voice. His hand flexed, ready to strike. Tasha's body was already reacting before he could make the move. She anticipated his charge, reading his body language like a book. As Todd lunged, she shifted to the side, moving with such fluidity that he barely had time to register it before she was behind him. With a quick motion, she placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward with his own momentum. He stumbled, disoriented, and before he could recover, Tasha swept his legs out from under him. Todd hit the ground with a thud, his pride crashing along with his body. The gang fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of Todd's labored breathing as he lay sprawled on the pavement. The other men, now frozen in place, looked at their leader, unsure of what to do next. They had seen Todd fall without a single blow landed on him. This wasn't some random street brawl anymore. It was a confrontation that had just gone terribly wrong for them. Tasha took a slow step back, her stance still calm and controlled, as if she were simply stepping away from a difficult situation. She didn't need to say another word. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. The remaining men were watching her, now fully aware of how outmatched they were. They had thought they were in control, that their numbers and bravado would be enough. But now they realized the truth. "Get up, Todd," one of the men finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "Get up. Man, we have to get out of here." But Todd didn't respond immediately. He was still on the ground, his chest heaving as he processed the chaos unfolding before him. His bravado had crumbled, and with it, any trace of his former confidence. Tasha glanced at the group. "This doesn't have to go any further. You leave me alone, and you walk away. That's the end of it." There was a moment of silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The gang members were caught in a crossroads. Their pride pushed them to continue, but the fear in their eyes held them back. The decision hung in the balance, and for the first time, it wasn't Todd's command that mattered. It was the collective hesitation of a group realizing they had crossed a line that they couldn't uncross. The standoff lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. Todd was still sprawled on the ground, clutching his chest and trying to catch his breath. His eyes flickered toward his gang, the once unshakable leader now humbled, vulnerable in front of the woman they had all underestimated. The gang members, once eager to join in and prove their dominance, were now shifting uneasily on their feet. They exchanged anxious glances, unsure of what to do next. Tasha's gaze remained steady, unshaken, scanning the group with calm precision. She could feel their collective uncertainty like a pulse in the air, their bravado crumbling with every passing second. The power had shifted, but it wasn't over yet. She knew how quickly desperation could turn into recklessness, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She had to be ready. "Let's go, Todd," one of the men muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His hands were slightly trembling, and he looked as if he'd seen enough. The others nodded in agreement, but Todd, still lying on the pavement, looked back up at Tasha with a mixture of fury and disbelief. I'm not letting her get away with this," he growled, pushing himself up slowly. His movements were sluggish, but there was still a fire in his eyes. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. Tasha stepped forward, her movements deliberate and controlled. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't desperate. She knew exactly how to handle this. As Todd clumsily got to his feet, she took a half step back, creating just enough space between them. She could sense the shift in his energy. He was gathering himself for one final push, one last attempt to regain control. He lunged forward, his fists aimed at her midsection, trying to overpower her with sheer brute force. But Tasha had already anticipated the move. She had studied his body language and knew exactly how he would react. With a quick sidestep, she let him stumble past her. His momentum carried him forward, but Tasha didn't just evade him. She used his own force against him. In one fluid motion, she dropped low, sweeping her leg beneath his and pulling his body off balance. Todd hit the ground once more, this time face first into the cold pavement. The sound of his body slamming against the concrete echoed through the alleyway, followed by a sharp grunt of pain. He wasn't getting up anytime soon. The remaining gang members stood frozen, their faces pale. They had watched as their leader had fallen, and now they were left with nothing but a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomachs. The woman they had intended to intimidate had just laid their leader flat twice in a matter of minutes, and there was no sign that she was slowing down. Tasha didn't wait for them to make up their minds. With a calm yet firm voice, she spoke again. "You all need to walk away. Now." Her words were simple, but there was no mistaking the authority in her tone. The fight had been taken out of them. They stood there, unsure whether to press on or retreat. Fear began to creep into their hearts, making them question the decisions they'd made up until now. One of them, the younger man who had been the first to hesitate, turned to look at his comrades. His hand trembled as he reached for his jacket, his eyes darting nervously between Todd and Tasha. "Let's go," he said, his voice shaky. "This isn't worth it." The others hesitated, but they could feel the shift in the air. The woman standing before them wasn't someone to be messed with. It was no longer a game of intimidation or bravado. It was a matter of survival. And survival meant retreat. The gang members began to back away, slowly at first, then faster as they realized how much trouble they were in. Tasha didn't move, her posture relaxed but alert. She didn't need to chase them. They were already defeated, their pride shattered, their will broken. They had come for a fight, and she had given them exactly what they didn't expect. A lesson in restraint, in control, in skill. As the last of them turned and disappeared into the shadows of the alley, Tasha exhaled slowly, the tension in her body beginning to ease. Her eyes flicked back to Todd, still lying on the pavement, his breath ragged as he struggled to push himself up. She didn't bother to say anything more. He was a man out of his depth now, a shell of the person who had once thought he could control the situation. Tasha's gaze lingered for a moment, as though considering whether to help him up, but she quickly dismissed the thought. He was no longer her concern. With a final glance at the alleyway, Tasha turned and walked away, her steps confident and steady. The night had returned to its quiet hum, the threat of violence now a fading memory. She had stood her ground, and in the process, she had reminded herself and the world around her that sometimes strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to take control and when to walk away. Tasha's boots echoed against the pavement as she walked away from the alley, the sound sharp in the cool silence of the night. Her mind was already shifting gears, processing the confrontation she had just experienced. Her heart rate had settled, her breath returned to its regular rhythm, but her mind was still sharp, always alert, always analyzing. In the few minutes of the encounter, her body had reacted instinctively, each movement dictated by years of training, years of discipline, skill, and control. She had faced worse in her time as a Navy SEAL. She had fought in environments far more dangerous than this alley, against foes far more skilled, in situations that required more than just physical strength. This had been nothing. But it had still been a test, a reminder that even in civilian life, danger could find you in the most unexpected places. As she walked, her hand instinctively brushed against the small, metal pendant she wore around her neck, her Navy SEAL dog tag, a reminder of who she was, where she came from, and the life she had left behind, or at least tried to leave behind. But life, she knew, was never so simple. Her mind flickered back to the men she had just left behind. Todd, the gang leader, had been humiliated, but that wasn't what bothered her. What troubled her was how easily they had underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman walking alone through a dark alley. She was a force, trained and forged by years of intense combat and survival techniques. They hadn't known who they were dealing with, and in that brief moment, they had learned exactly how wrong they were. But that wasn't always a good thing. People didn't like being shown how weak they truly were. A shiver ran down Tasha's spine as she reached the corner of the street, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. There were still people walking around, unaware of the incident that had just unfolded, but the energy had shifted. The people who might have once walked by without a second thought were now looking at her with suspicion, curiosity, or fear. The city had a way of turning the unpredictable into the familiar. After all, everyone had seen a fight or two. But what they hadn't seen was a woman take down a gang of men like she'd just done. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from her old team leader, Sergeant Cooper. "Mission debrief tomorrow. 10 a.m., don't be late." Tasha's lips curled into a faint smile. It had been a while since she'd heard from the team. Her time as a Navy SEAL felt like a lifetime ago. But deep down, she knew the bond she had with those people, her brothers and sisters, would never break. She had left the military life behind when she retired, hoping to start something new, something quieter. But her past had a way of catching up with her, reminding her that certain skills, once learned, could never be forgotten. The buzz of a car engine rumbled in the distance, breaking her from her reverie. Tasha slipped her phone back into her pocket, turning toward the familiar intersection that led to her apartment. The night was quieter now, almost peaceful, as if the city itself had exhaled, taking a deep breath after the storm that had passed. But Tasha knew better than to think the danger was over. It never was. People like Todd and his gang didn't forget. They'd regroup, lick their wounds, and probably be angrier the next time they saw her. She wasn't naive enough to think it was finished. Still, she wouldn't let fear guide her steps. Tasha walked with purpose, her shoulders squared, her posture confident. She was a Navy SEAL, a soldier forged in the fires of war. But now she was something more. A woman living a life of her own, balancing the lessons of her past with the challenges of her present. She didn't look back. Not once. She had already won. The rest, as far as she was concerned, was just noise. And noise didn't stop her from moving forward. Tasha's apartment was modest, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city where the noise of downtown seemed distant. As she stepped inside, the comforting hum of solitude enveloped her. She locked the door behind her, the familiar sound of the deadbolt sliding into place providing her with a sense of security. The space was sparse, just the essentials. A couch, a small dining table, a few framed photos of her old team, and a few personal touches that reminded her of her time in the Navy. On the counter, a half-empty cup of coffee sat, cold now, abandoned during her rushed exit earlier that evening. Her mind was still racing from the encounter in the alley. Though it had been easy enough to handle, the gang had left her with something she couldn't shake. The feeling that something was wrong. The whole situation had felt too familiar. As she tossed her keys into the bowl by the door and slipped off her jacket, she could still hear the sound of Todd's body hitting the ground. The confused silence of his gang members, and the way their eyes had darted from one another, unsure of how to proceed. They had underestimated her, but that wasn't the part that worried her. It was the fact that they had been so reckless, so careless. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know her past, her skills. But now, they would remember. And that made her uneasy. Just as she was about to head to her small kitchen to grab a fresh cup of coffee, she heard a knock at her door. A hard, forceful knock. Tasha's heart skipped a beat, but her hand didn't falter. She didn't jump. She didn't panic. Instead, her instincts kicked in. A quick glance at the peephole confirmed that she didn't recognize the person on the other side. It was a man, mid-30s, with a leather jacket and a calm, almost professional demeanor. She paused for a moment, then moved silently toward the kitchen to grab a knife from the counter, her senses heightened. She had learned long ago that anyone who came knocking this late at night wasn't just making a friendly visit. She didn't believe in coincidences. Another knock. Louder this time. "Who is it?" she called, her voice steady, but edged with suspicion. "I'm looking for Tasha," the man said, his voice deep, but not threatening. He sounded like someone who was used to giving orders, someone who was confident in his purpose. Tasha's mind raced. She didn't recognize the voice. She didn't recognize the man outside her door. "Who's asking?" she replied, her grip tightening around the knife. Her eyes narrowed, every muscle in her body alert, poised to act. There was a brief pause, followed by a sigh. "My name's Cooper. Sergeant Cooper. Navy. I served with you." Tasha froze. Her hand went still on the knife handle. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world outside her door faded away, and all she could hear was the sound of her pulse in her ears. Sergeant Cooper. It had been years since she had heard that name. He was a key part of the team she had left behind when she retired from the Navy. A no-nonsense leader who always had her back, who had seen her through some of the toughest operations of her life. She trusted him implicitly, but the years had put distance between them. Distance she thought was permanent. Tasha moved swiftly, placing the knife down on the counter, and adjusted her stance. She had to be careful. Things had changed. People had changed. She opened the door just a crack, enough to get a glimpse of his face. Sergeant Cooper stood there, looking exactly as she remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, his sharp eyes scanning her as though assessing a potential threat. There was a faint scar on his chin that she hadn't noticed before, a sign of time passing, of battles fought and won, or perhaps lost. "Tasha," he said, his tone warmer now. "We need to talk." The door didn't open any wider. She wasn't inviting him in just yet. "What is it, Cooper?" Her voice was cool, controlled, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "I'll explain everything inside," he said, his gaze lingering on her before returning to meet hers with a serious look. "It's important." Tasha hesitated for just a moment, sizing him up. She knew he wasn't the type to show up unannounced unless it was urgent. Still, she didn't like surprises. With a final glance at him, she stepped back and unlocked the door fully, allowing him inside, but she didn't let her guard down. As Cooper entered, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had to say would change everything. And in her gut, she knew this wasn't the last time she'd be hearing from Todd or his gang. Not by a long shot. She closed the door behind him, bracing herself for whatever was about to unfold. Tasha shut the door behind Sergeant Cooper, locking it with a soft click. She motioned toward the couch, a silent invitation to sit, but she remained standing, her posture guarded. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. No longer was it just her private space, but now it felt like a crossroads, her past and her present meeting in the most unexpected of ways. Cooper walked over and lowered himself onto the couch, his expression serious. His eyes scanned the room briefly, settling on the photos of her old team that adorned the walls. She knew what he was thinking. They had all been through hell together. The photos were a constant reminder of the bonds they shared, the missions they'd completed, and the price they paid. Tasha crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "You've got 5 minutes," she said. Her voice was cold, the years of distance between them evident in the way she spoke. Cooper sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Tasha, I didn't come here to waste your time. This isn't some social visit." She nodded, staying silent. Whatever he was about to say, she could feel the gravity in his words already. Something was wrong. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face now inches from hers. "I don't know if you've been keeping tabs on the news, but something big is going down. There's a network out there, a group operating under the radar. They've been making moves, getting more violent, and they've been recruiting." He paused, looking at her with steady eyes. "And I think you know who's involved in this." Tasha's stomach twisted. Her mind flickered back to the encounter with Todd and his gang earlier that evening. The recklessness, the confidence, the way they had acted as if they had nothing to lose. She had seen that before, those same traits in other people, in other missions. She'd been right to be suspicious. There was more going on than just a random street altercation. "Who's behind it?" she asked, her voice low. Cooper's eyes darkened. "We don't have all the details yet, but the intel points to an organization that's been growing, getting bolder. They've infiltrated local gangs, and now they've started targeting high-value people, people who know too much. People like you." Tasha felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't help it. Despite her years of training, the mention of her name sent a chill through her. Asterisk people like you asterisk, it wasn't just a threat. It was a message. Whoever was behind, this wasn't just interested in making trouble. They were hunting specific individuals. And now, for some reason, she had become a target. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cooper shook his head. "I don't know yet, but we think you were spotted. We think they saw what you did tonight, how you handled those guys. They're probably already looking for you." Tasha exhaled sharply, running her fingers through her hair. This was worse than she had imagined. The gang she had fought off earlier was just a small piece of a larger puzzle, one that had its eyes set on her. She had been trying to leave her old life behind, to stay out of the military's shadow. But it seemed like her past had caught up with her faster than she could have ever predicted. "You think they'll come after me again?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "They will," Cooper replied grimly. "And they won't stop. Not until they get what they want." Tasha paced across the room, her mind spinning. She had spent years training, learning, and evolving. But none of that mattered if her past had found its way back to haunt her. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. She could walk away and keep her head down, hope the threat passed. But that wasn't her. It never had been. "Okay," she said finally, stopping in her tracks and turning to face him. "What do you want me to do?" Cooper gave a slight nod, acknowledging the steel in her voice. "I want you to help us take them down. You know what they're capable of, and we need people with your skills to get in deep." Tasha didn't hesitate. This wasn't a life she had chosen, but it was one she knew. She had never been able to walk away from a fight that needed fighting. She wasn't about to start now. "Fine," she said, her jaw set. "But I'm doing this on my terms." Cooper didn't flinch. He knew better than anyone that Tasha had always been her own person, but he also knew that when she agreed, there was no turning back. "We'll get you back in touch with the team," he said. "You'll have everything you need." Tasha nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. The game had changed. The stakes were higher now, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not some shadowy organization, not Todd and his gang, take her down without a fight. She moved toward the window, staring out into the city that was about to change forever. This was her world again, the world of shadows, danger, and deception, and she would face it head-on, just like she always had. No turning back. Tasha stood by the window, looking out at the city that now seemed more like a battlefield than the quiet refuge it had once been. The lights from the surrounding buildings flickered like distant stars, but instead of offering comfort, they reminded her of how exposed she was. The storm was coming, and she wasn't about to hide from it. She turned away from the window and faced Cooper, who was now standing, his arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his posture. They were both on edge, knowing the task ahead of them wasn't going to be easy. "Where do we start?" Tasha asked, her voice steady, her resolve clear. There was no hesitation now, only the focus of someone who had been in situations far worse than this. She had faced impossible odds before, but the stakes were higher this time. Whoever was behind this operation was organized and dangerous. They weren't just targeting people for petty reasons. They were building something larger, and Tasha was certain they had their sights on her for a reason. Cooper unfolded his arms and pulled out a folder from his bag, placing it on the coffee table between them. "This is the intel we've gathered so far. We think the group is based out of a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. We haven't been able to confirm everything, but the signs point to a stronghold there." Tasha stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the folder, her mind already analyzing the situation. She could almost feel the heat of the warehouse, the sense of urgency that came with infiltrating a place like that. She needed to get in, find out what they were up to, and take them down before they could act on whatever their plan was. But it wouldn't be easy. A group this dangerous wasn't going to just roll over. She glanced at Cooper. "What's the backup situation? We need to be prepared for a fight. And if they're after me specifically, there's no telling how much firepower they have." Cooper's eyes darkened. "We're trying to get reinforcements, but you know how it is. We're spread thin, and our resources are limited. For now, it's just you and me. We'll have to rely on speed and stealth." Tasha nodded. She wasn't expecting a full team to back her up. That was fine. She worked best alone, anyway. The fewer people involved, the less chance for things to go wrong. But she also knew the risks. If they weren't careful, the mission could end in disaster. "We'll need to hit them fast," Tasha said, thinking out loud. "Get in, get the intel, and get out. No unnecessary risks. We don't want to be spotted." Cooper agreed. "We'll go in tonight. If we wait, they'll have time to cover their tracks, or worse, move their operation. We're running out of time." As the plan took shape, Tasha's mind focused on the task at hand. She had dealt with far worse than this, had gone into missions with less information, fewer resources, and against enemies that outnumbered her. But now, there was something else hanging in the air, a feeling that went beyond the mission itself. This was personal. They had targeted her, and that made it a whole new ballgame. "What about Todd and the rest of the gang?" she asked, her tone flat but pointed. Cooper hesitated for a moment. "We're tracking them too. But the priority is the operation at the warehouse. If we can take down the main group, the rest of it will fall apart. If Todd tries anything, we'll handle it." Tasha's jaw tightened. She wasn't worried about Todd. She had already sent him a message. But if the gang regrouped and went after her again, she'd be ready. There was no question about it. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but time was not on their side. She could already feel the adrenaline beginning to surge through her veins. She didn't need sleep. Not now. Turning back to Cooper, she said, "Let's move. We don't have much time." Cooper nodded, reaching for his bag and slinging it over his shoulder. He grabbed a few more items, tools, weapons, and communication gear. The kind of stuff they'd need for a mission like this. Tasha followed suit, pulling on her jacket, securing her gear, and grabbing the keys to her car. The world outside her apartment was dark, but she wasn't afraid of the night. In fact, she thrived in it. They left the apartment together, locking the door behind them. The city was quiet, but there was a sense of impending danger that hung over the streets. Tasha's instincts were on high alert. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she didn't flinch. This was what she did. This was who she was. As they got into the car and headed for the warehouse, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They were about to walk into the heart of something much bigger than they realized. And no matter how big it got, she would see it through to the end.